11th of May, 1940, 4:30 a.m. In the months before May 1940, my crew and I had flown 3 uneventful but successful daylight reconnaissance sorties over the heavily defended Ruhr region in West Germany. Surviving these flights and the long hours we had spent practicing our survey photography had filled us with confidence. However, as the sun rose in the sky over our small airfield in Poix, near Amiens, I could not help but be filled with apprehension, because the day before, 3 out of 6 aircraft in our flight, all engaged on the same photographic tasks as ourselves, had not returned. The British Expeditionary Force had begun its advance into Belgium to dig in along a planned line early in the morning the previous day. Our task, and that of the other 5 crews in our flight, was to carry out a photographic survey of the area in front of that line, which, in theory, was to hold the advancing Germans. Our photographs would be used to make accurate maps for the direction of artillery fire. Although our plans for the day's flying were complete, we had to wait for first photographic light. Before this time, the shadows cast by the newly risen sun made the photographs unacceptable to map makers. I was fortunate with my crew. We had bonded well as a team, and we trusted each other. Benz was the gunner. He was 18 and only just old enough to be allowed overseas. Christie, my navigator, was the old man of the crew at 28, and I was almost exactly halfway between them. That morning, as we sat next to our Blenheim, waiting for the sun to dictate when we should take to the sky, I was acutely aware of the reality of war. Germany had finally unleashed her aggression and made her intentions clear. "11th of May 1940, 2:15 p.m. Less than 10 hours later, now in the air, Alastair's vacuum of isolation was shattered. For perhaps a minute and a half, diving and twisting through space which seemed to be filled with bullets rather than air, we fought them until a burst shattered my instrument panel and my starboard engine exploded into flame. At the same time, a scream of agony and they've got me," came from Bentz into my earphones. As Christie turned towards me, blood burst across his forehead, and he slumped over the maps on his slender navigator's table. By this time, the ground was coming up, fast towards me. I still had some control, but there was little I could do except thrust my poor, gallant, blazing Blenheim through the tops of some trees and a bunch of electric cables beyond them onto a large meadow which providentially appeared before me. I hauled Christie by his parachute harness out of the cockpit hatch. On the ground, I dragged him clear of the mass of flame and thick black smoke, and went back to see if I could do anything for Bentz. To my amazement, I saw his head appear momentarily from his opened gun turret, before he slumped back into a sudden burst of smoke and flame. This cleared as I jumped onto the fuselage, enough for me to see him lying inert. I grabbed his harness and pulled him out. Until he screamed, I thought he was dead. Certainly, his left thigh was a horrible mess. As I dragged him to where Christie lay, the Messerschmitt 109s dived down, one after the other, their bullets stuttering across the ground around us, before they wheeled exultantly away. Petrol and ammunition from the Blenheim was exploding viciously, and a bundle of burning flame flew derisively past me. With an uncomfortable feeling that German soldiers might appear at any moment, I dragged the 2 sergeants, both now unconscious, to a thick hedge and pushed them under it. Gradually, the road became more and more congested, with refugees going westwards. My face was beginning to sting and throb. I passed Louvain, without any sign of a casualty clearing station, and, for want of another idea, continued on the way to Brussels. A steady stream of people on foot were plodding along the road beside the traffic, lumping suitcases and pushing laden prams. They all seemed to be intent on minding their own business, as if survival was a personal affair, not shared with those thronging around them. Houses and shops were shuttered, having every appearance of not wanting to be bothered with the passing flood of unhappy people. It was warm in the evening sun. It was now 8:30, and I had been up for 16 hours. A feeling had come over me that I was to be a part of this slow, cattle-like movement of people indefinitely, when suddenly the plodding scene was violently interrupted by a formation of Junker 87s in the line astern, diving on our road, bombing and machine gunning. Most of the bombs missed the road, and the machine gun bullets swept in a capricious fashion about it. All forward movement stopped, and people dived for cover in a patternless, terrified reaction, knocking into each other. Our car was not touched, but just in front a woman carrying a baby was hit in the back, cutting her nearly in two. As she arched back, the baby flew over her shoulder and landed on the pavement, its head split open. The attack, having come with a shattering tumult of sound, left behind it a momentary silence. Then, slowly, people picked themselves up and started to move on with the cars, stepping over the bodies of the mother and the baby. May 18th. Alastair awakes in a military hospital, having been in a coma for a week. I was growing more and more anxious about the German advance and the possibility of being captured. As soon as Sister Adrienne left, I staggered out of bed and had to hang on to a table as my head began to swim. After a while, I tottered about the room slowly and ventured into the corridor. But there were so many people scurrying about that I thought it safer, and certainly pleasanter, to return to our room. I dressed slowly into my overalls and flying boots, and it was just as well I did so. I had hardly finished when 4 stretcher-bearers, accompanied by Sister Adrienne, arrived for Christie and Bence. She exclaimed with pleasure when she saw I was dressed. "Ah, c'est beau! You are now being taken to the station with your 2 friends. I shall come to see you away." I did not feel very beau. I had 8 days of stubble growing around and through the scabs on my burnt face. But at least my overalls were clean, and so were my boots, which were shining for the first time. With Sister Adrienne beside me, I followed the 2 stretchers, whose bearers, fortunately for me, could only make slow progress, down the corridor and the stairs, through the entrance hall and down the steps, towards the waiting ambulance, one of a line. And Christie and Bence were pushed into their places inside, an orderly waving at me to follow them. But Sister Adrienne held up her hand. "Un moment, s'il vous plaît," she said, and leaned to press her cheek against mine. "My dear boy, bonne chance," she murmured. "Take these tablets as soon as you are settled in the train, and you will awake in Amiens." Dear Sister Adrienne, I owed her so much for taking me under her wing. I found the address of her sisterhood on a card in my pocket in May 1945, 5 years later, when I was passing through Brussels on my way home from Germany. I looked everywhere for her. She had died of pneumonia and malnutrition the year before. May 21st, 1940. Alastair is asked to return Blenheims back to England. After takeoff, I continued to be aware of how heavy and sluggish my Blenheim felt. Whenever I throttled back a little, I lost height immediately. I had 3 airmen in the cockpit with me. They had asked if I would give them a lift back to avoid travelling via Boulogne. Over Tangmere, by force of habit, I turned to read the cylinder head temperature gauges. Their reading was needed for the post-flight report. But I was amazed to see 3 faces in a row behind me, peering ahead and grinning. If there are others behind them, I thought, it's no wonder the aircraft feels sluggish. I must be heavily overloaded. I approached and landed at a much higher speed than usual to avoid sinking. When I parked, I switched off and left the cockpit, followed by my 3 cockpit companions. I waited by the air gunner's hatch for my 3 stowaways, only to be staggered when 9 airmen all climbed stiffly out. They must have slipped in after I started up. How on earth they had found room for their bodies, I could not think. My stowaways were stretching, rubbing themselves, laughing with relief and delight at being back in England so quickly and safely, and clustered around to thank me for the lift. Truly, in this case, ignorance was bliss, if just one engine had failed. "Why didn't you divide yourselves up amongst the 3 Blenheims?" I asked, "instead of all piling into mine? I was dangerously overloaded." A corporal grinned at me cheerfully. "You wouldn't think to catch us catching lifts off Sprogs, would you, sir? We knew we'd be okay with you." May, evacuation of Dunkirk. The reports of the bitter anger in the British Expeditionary Force against us were increasing in volume, and there were unpleasant scenes at Channel ports with returning soldiers insulting anyone in RAF uniform. Accordingly, we were told that, when we had dropped our bombs, we should fly low over the Dunkirk beaches and let the soldiers see us. I was not at all anxious to do any such thing. One reason why we had survived the day before was because we had made our approaches to the targets, keeping away from trouble as long as possible, taking the safest route home as soon as our bombs had gone. Up to this morning, we had been attacking targets east of Newport, but our targets today were well west and southwest, as the Germans were following the contracting perimeter. We dropped our bombs and, following instructions, I pushed the nose down so that when I reached the British positions, I was flying along at about 50 feet over the crowded beaches, waggling my wings. Stride, at the back, was waving from his gun turret. Suddenly, from directly in front of me, came a heavy, no-deflection burst of Bren gunfire, and a solid stream of bullets thumped into my starboard engine. There was instantaneously a belch of thick, black smoke and an explosion of flame. All I could do was slam my throttle shut and shove the nose of the Blenheim onto the sand straight ahead. Through the billows of smoke, I could see soldiers fanning out from in front of me. Farrow, navigating, had already opened the hatch above us, and we ground to a jagged stop. He pulled himself out, and I followed him as quickly as I could, onto the port wing and jumped from it, onto the sand, straight into the arms of a Roman Catholic padre in his surplice. He grabbed my hand, and together we dashed up the beach with petrol and ammunition exploding around us. We flopped down, panting, and hid behind a shallow fold in the sand. "My word," he said between gasps, "I never believed the Holy Ghost could be scattered so quickly." June 7th, waiting at Coulommiers. Sergeant Hallows, a kind and useful member of the ground crew, approaches Alastair and says, "I'm sorry to bother you, sir, but I wonder if you would speak to the men for me. Some of the irks are beginning to pong a bit. I know washing isn't easy, But if you could give them a nudge, I'm sure it would help, and they would pay attention to you." "Certainly I will," I said straight away, and Hallows looked relieved. I think he thought I was going to tell him to go away and be his own nanny. "You are absolutely right to bring the matter up. Give me 10 minutes to collect my thoughts and then gather everyone around." I went to my cockpit, where I had various manuals, and took out the blue, Rexine-covered RAF Field Service pocketbook. I flipped through it, making jottings on a piece of white card. 5 years later, after the war, I found this card in one of the pockets of the overalls I was wearing that day and had jotted a list. Worsening conditions, clean, healthy, Army number 1, FFA, shaving, P&S, boil water, foot rot, socks. When the men were gathered, I addressed them. In the Army, they talk about 2 forms of washing, and I want you to look on these as the minimum required. The first is called Army number 1. It consists of rolling up your shirt sleeves, tucking a towel into the back of your shirt collar, and washing your hands, neck, and face. The second is called an FFA, which stands for feet, fork, and armpits. If you are clever, you expose each area to be attacked in turn. But it is really much better to find somewhere once a day where you can strip off and wash all over. The weather is fine and warm, and you won't catch pneumonia. I paused and looked along the line. This had raised a laugh, as I had intended. Our little party of 22 was isolated, compact and disciplined in the surrounding chaos. This was a scene which remained sharply etched onto my memory, partly because, for the first time in my life, I was speaking to others about their personal hygiene, but also because of the strong feeling of responsibility for the men and the fellowship I had shared with them. June 11th. Alastair is meeting a comrade at Chartres Cathedral in the early hours of the morning. France is almost lost. "Alastair," said Chancery, softly but firmly, "you must go into the cathedral. It is an amazing sight, an amazing atmosphere. I'd no idea. I'm not much of a God-botherer, but please go and see for yourself." Without a word, wondering what had so affected him, I left him on the steps and went through the main entrance to face a truly awesome spectacle. The vast upper reaches of the cathedral were mainly in shadow, but at ground level, thousands and thousands of candles were burning. They burned as far as I could see, in an unbroken line all the way round from one side of the entrance to the other. At the altars of various side chapels, the line of candles swelled into thick masses of flame, with a particularly massive concentration in front of the main altar. Every pew and chair, and almost every available piece of floor space, was occupied by worshippers and refugees, kneeling, lying, sitting and standing, praying, talking, eating, drinking and sleeping. The air was murmurous with soft words. Acolytes moved about with difficulty, swinging censers. I stood, gazing in wonder. The force of the massed prayer seemed an almost measurable factor, and, as agnostic as I was, I felt growing in me a hope of eventual peace and of right prevailing in the end. Shortly after Chartres Cathedral, Alastair's thoughts are with his brother Colin, who served and died with the 51st Highlanders. We set off a little wearily to walk the 3 miles back to the airfield, but after about 15 minutes, we were delighted and relieved to see the 3-tonner coming to meet us. Sergeant Hallows had been woken by guards changing over and, after seeing we had not returned, set out to see if he could help. As usual, he had done the right thing without being told. He was a great hand, and I told him so. It was 5 o'clock in the morning before we bagged ourselves. My last thought before I fell asleep was of the thousands of candles burning in the cathedral, miserably fearing they boded ill for Colin and the 51st. Before going to sleep, I had been told the Germans had crossed the Seine in several places, that the French government had moved from Paris to Tours, and thick fog had prevented any question of the 51st evacuating. When I was woken 5 hours later by Robinson, coming to brief us for the day's tasks, he said, "Alastair, I'm desperately sorry to tell you that the 51st came under direct fire from the cliffs to the east and west of their position. The French 9th Corps capitulated at 8 o'clock, and what was left of the 51st surrendered at 10:30. I'm so sorry to give you such bad news." "13th of June. Whatever next?" The next day's flying was memorable for one untoward, unmilitary event. Hallows had put up a small rectangular tent, some 8 feet by 4 feet, for the aircrew to use as a locker room. The only possession of mine in there was a fleecy-lined flying Irving jacket, which one of the navigators had been using as a bed. In mid-afternoon, whilst we were away on a sortie, I was told that the 2 sergeants guarding the camp were taken hugely by surprise because a refugee car suddenly turned off the road and raced across the few yards to the tent, brakes screeching to a halt. A woman and a younger man dragged a moaning, crying girl out of the car and hustled her into the tent, the flaps closing behind them. One of the 2 guards, who had run across shouting in alarm, thrust his head into the tent and stood frozen in shock. As Hallows, alerted by the cries, came running, the poor young guard withdrew from the tent and, paper white, gasped, "Sergeant, she's having a baby on Panton's Irving jacket." Although Hallows admitted freely afterwards that he was fair flummoxed at first, and a complete rookie as a midwife, he went quickly into action. When I landed an hour and a half later, I could not understand why men were standing around, grinning up at me in the cockpit. When I switched off, everyone tried at the same time to tell me what had happened. The importune birth had been entirely successful. The baby and its mother were safe in a nearby farm with its father and grandmother. The tent had returned to normal, except for the smell of carbolic. My Irving jacket had been burned, and the poor boy, who had made the discovery, was already nicknamed Doc, because his diagnosis of the girl's complaint had been so quick and accurate. "17th of June. Alastair finds out about the sinking of the LANCASTRIA. On our way to Verdun, We passed over the large airfield at Nantes, which, littered with abandoned equipment, showed every sign of the end of a retreat. We had been looking forward to talking about our earlier comic downing of a Storch, but about half an hour after we had landed, whilst we were refuelling, an RAF intelligence officer sent by Robinson for our reconnaissance report appeared with news which put a stop to any light-heartedness. That morning, at the port of Saint-Nazaire, some 40 miles away, the troop ship Lancastria, crammed with RAF troops, had been bombed and sunk with a large loss of life. We, of course, immediately thought of Hallowes and his party, hoping they had not been on board, but dreading they had. When we saw Robinson that evening, I said to him, "Do you think Hallowes was on Lancastria?" "I expect so. Why?" Robinson looked puzzled, and I then realised he had not, by some quirk of circumstance, heard about the bombing. He was considerably shaken when I told him. Oh my God, he muttered quietly to himself. Amongst the 3,000 RAF lives lost in the attack on Lancastria, and hundreds more civilians, we later found out, were Hallowes and all his men. They had been killed simply as a result of staff confusion, which had prevented them being flown home. End piece. Even by 18th of June 1940, the purposeful, yet almost carefree atmosphere I had met at Colomiers on 7th of June seemed a long time ago. It was difficult to believe that only 11 days had elapsed in which the humiliation of France was completed. Of the 22 members of the unit whom I had spent time with there, 16 had died by the time France fell, and 4 more were killed later on in the war. In July 1940, I was firing at a Messerschmitt 110 over Belgium near Brussels. I saw smoke coming from it, and it exploded just before a fire took hold in my Blenheim, probably from some incendiary bullet I had collected. I managed to crash land my aircraft, but was taken prisoner on landing and moved to a burns hospital. Nearly 5 years later, when the war ended, I was returned home.